Hello, my name is Jesan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Bonus. There's no book reading on bonus episodes. These are interviews, rants, raves, insights, and other audio musings, and conversations with interesting people about leadership. Because listening to me and an interesting guest talk about leadership for a couple of hours is infinitely better than reading and trying to understand yet another business book. The Tyrell Corporation manufactured biological androids, or replicants. Designed to serve human pleasure and to be disposable, replicants only had about a 4-year lifespan. In the future, imagined by Philip K. Dick in his seminal book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, replicants are, by their very existence, a challenge to the long-standing human order. In Brian Aldiss's short story, Super Toys Last All Summer Long, the idea of intelligent feeling machines, or mechas, is explored through the lens of solving human problems of isolation, loneliness, and depression in a post-climate change dystopia. And of course, the most famous thinking machines in science fiction zipped along through the galaxy for 8 seasons of Star Trek: The Next Generation. Yes, the ship was piloted by algorithmic artificial intelligence. You can go back and look at it. It's everywhere now. You can watch it anywhere you want. Why is it that historic dystopian science fiction tends to do a better job, or at least tends to open up the can of worms anyway, of exploring the ethical conundrums involved in creating machines that human beings then anthropomorphize, that's a big word, and layer human habits, behaviors, and emotions on top of? Why do engineers in the real now, or the desert of the real, as the Matrix would have us know it, often minimize or ignore the ramifications of the potential for creating machines that think? And of course, because we're a leadership podcast, how can a leader walk through a future world where artificial intelligence runs our cars, our highways, our searches on the internet, what we see in ads, and what we buy for our refrigerators, and still lead human beings effectively? Oh, wait a minute. We are living at the beginning of Philip K. Dick and Brian Aldiss's imagined future right now. There are so many problems, so many opportunities, ethical, moral, legal, and philosophical, to unpack here, even as our world, now firmly in the grip of the technologists and the engineers, hurls towards the unknowable, not because we should, but just because we can. Our guest today, Marisa Zalaback, is a speaker, psychologist, social, emotional, and creative intelligence consultant, researcher, and advocate for human well-being with artificial intelligence. She runs the Open Channel Culture Project, which partners with businesses, schools, healthcare organizations to support adaptive leaders navigating constantly changing landscapes, which, in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, should come home to everybody right now. At the intersection of leadership and artificial intelligence, she leads the Human Arts Lab, or HAL, interactive experimental programs that reimagine the future through education and essential human skills in partnership with intelligent technologies, where they connect the dots for innovation: head, heart, hand, and creativity. Now, you may be wondering, if you're a small or medium-sized business owner who regularly listens to this podcast, or just a fan, why is Jesan talking to an artificial intelligence researcher person? Well, the reason I'm talking with this guest today, and the reason that you are hearing this interview right now in the sequence of conversations that we are having around the great book City of God by St. Augustine of Hippo, is that I am deeply interested in making sure that leaders are prepared for new technological wizardry, but not at the expense of old in some cases 1,588-year-old, hard-won human knowledge. And I want leaders to be intentional, be aware, and be alert to the arguments, all of them, both for and against, that such technological wizardry presents on a daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly basis. Remember, the motto of our podcast is no more accidental leadership. Welcome to the podcast, Marisa.
Hi. Welcome. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. I'm really pleased to be here.
So I gave you kind of a big open there, gave a lot of context for folks stepping in, at least my personal context about how I think about this issue. And I shouldn't say issue. Think about this technological delta that we are now sitting at, right? In 2022, right, when this podcast is being recorded. But enough of me talking. Why don't you tell our listeners, tell our viewers, what is it that you do exactly?
I'd be happy to. So I do a variety of things. I'll just start with that. So I tend to be more of a polymath on my journey. But my work as an adaptive leadership coach focuses on, as you were talking earlier, supporting leaders and teams thriving in constantly changing circumstances. To me, it's like being on the ocean. Right? You go out on the boat, you have no idea necessarily what the weather is going to be, but how are you going to get to the next point safely, or as safely as possible? And it's also, to me, not just about safety, but also how can we flourish, right? Not just getting there, but how can we flourish? And this was true before the pandemic. I think that the pandemic has just magnified it, honestly.
Now, with that magnification, with that ever-changing red roiling sea, right? They have blue ocean strategy, this term blue ocean strategy in business. I always think of it now as a red roiling ocean. I don't think of it as a blue ocean strategy anymore. There's no such thing as blue calming waters where you just sort of float along. It's been a red roiling sea for quite some time, and previous guests, we talked about Niccolo Machiavelli's great book, The Prince, right? And the previous guest on that podcast made mention of the point that change has always been around. It's always been dynamic through human history. And I made the counterpoint, which she conceded, that the speed with which change is coming is potentially the thing that is different. We used to have 20-year business cycles, right? Used to have 20-year innovation cycles. In some cases, you used to have 50-year innovation cycles. Now, innovation cycles, change cycles are literally hours, maybe days. There's consistent competitors popping up everywhere. So, how does that adaptive change work really come home with what you're doing around artificial intelligence and with the IEE project, and talk to us a little bit about what IEE is, because a lot of people don't know what that is.
Well, before I get, great. Before I get into IEEE, I just want to, I absolutely agree, is, the exponential speed at which things are now happening, right? Things have escalated. I'm a member of MIT's ULab, part of Presencing Institute, which really deals with convening leadership or focusing leadership for the emerging future. And this has been coming for a long time, right? This is Otto Scharmer. This is way, before, this has been for a very long time coming. Right. And it also involves, in this cascade, I'll call it, and sometimes tsunamis, we're also talking about sustainable development, which has to be a part and parcel of all of this. How are we going to sustain our planet? And then as we escalate this technology, human technology has existed since man figured out how, humans, I won't say man, since humans figured out how to take a stick and move a boulder, right? Or, those are technologies. So our technologies are simply escalating, but it's simply is almost a ridiculous statement, because it is happening in an unforeseen and unimaginable speed. And so adapting to that involves, I believe, that's actually what I base my work on, is that it really relies on developing human skills, real human, the human skills of adaptability, the human skills of agility and awareness, because some of those things, many of those things can be and are being programmed into artificially intelligent systems, and other word, i.e. robots, or bigger systems. And yet consciousness is the thing. Now there's the transhuman movement, and that's a whole nother conversation, or that's an additional conversation. But to begin with, this idea of human consciousness, right? And this is where people like Ray Kurzweil and Joshua Tenenbaum, who are leaders in this field, begin to talk about where are we, what are we missing in terms of also elevating, in a sense, or celebrating and utilizing the human parts of who we are. And as we do that, it's really important to be working on AI ethics. And that's where I wanted to kind of use that as a dovetail into when I was talking about IEEE. Because as we move forward, even though AI ethics has always been something that was important, or technological ethics, it's lagging in a very, very serious way. And this is the projects that IEEE works on. So IEEE is IEEE.org. It's the largest professional engineering organization in the world focused on humanity. And there are two international organizations, IEEE, ISO. There are many other, OECD and others in UNESCO, that are working toward these issues. But these are the two that are really professional organizations for engineers. And so they make recommendations. So I was a contributing author to the current recommendations for the design of AI related to human well-being, right? And so the thing is, I'm not an engineer, right? I was brought in as a psychologist,
right?
Because we do need the humans. And we do need, right?
Yeah, we do need the humans.
Well, it's also an interesting factoid, which I find very interesting, is that the original papers on artificial intelligent machines were all submitted into psychological journals.
Yes. So I'm going to jump off on that for just a second. Yes.
Yeah.
So what psychologists know from the last 100 years of research is that, A, we don't know anything about consciousness, or what we do know is very, very minuscule at best. We're getting better. I mean, we're finding out more, but it's still, it's an amazing thing. Let's just leave it at that, because that's a way deeper conversation that we can have on this podcast today. We'd be here for 5 hours talking about consciousness. But the Jungian ideas, right, of consciousness being embedded in forms, and then combining that with the Freudian ideas of consciousness around sort of how do we project ourselves forward into the world, right? The early, and I know this from looking at some of the early AI papers myself, the early AI researchers thought that you could get away with basically not embodying intelligence, right, in an object. You could just sort of make it float around. And what has the corner that has been turned, at least I'm hearing this recently, the corner that has been turned over the last, I would say, 10, 15 years, is this idea that the body matters. The object that the consciousness sits in is incredibly important for how that consciousness then engages in the world. And you would think that that would be, now the average person will hear this and will go, duh, I could have had a V8, right? But because they don't think about it, right? You don't think about your body. I don't think about my body. We just sort of, a very simple act. Like if I reach out and grab this pen that is in front of me on my desk, not only did I not think about that, I have trouble even describing it because it's just an act. I don't break it down. But if you're seeking to solve it as an engineering problem, that's that simple act that I just did there that my 5-year-old does is an incredibly complicated engineering act that involves a ton of different layers and also involves human consciousness. Am I correct in my analysis on this, or am I incorrect?
You are. I mean, I don't know if it's so much of it. You are touching on all. I'll say what you're doing is touching on all of the points that are being looked at. The thing is, more than anything in psychology, we go from what's correct
Right.
And what are we really investigating? What are we really looking at? All of those things are true, right? Neurologically, what you're really talking about is the neurological system, and the place where people get caught up is, there's actually a fantastic book called Extended Mind by Annie Murphy Paul, who talks quite a bit about this fallacy, that we have. It's a myth that we have, that our brains are like computers, and in certain ways, the computational points of our brain are.
Right.
But our mind is not the same as our brain.
Right. That's right.
Right. And so our mind is what you're describing, which is which is the much deeper, more advanced levels of what is consciousness, right? So our consciousness involves our entire neurological system, our memories, right? There's so much that is involved in our memory, and where is our memory held, right? So then we get into epigenetics and all of that, where you're going into the idea of our memories are held even intergenerationally. Right. So and you're right about the idea that consciousness, there's ideas about consciousness, but there's no hard and fast evidence of what consciousness is. That's what, it's almost like that's the oil race right now, right? If it were, AI is compared very often to oil. It's right. Data is the new oil. And in a sense, this idea of how can we get to consciousness, of course, that's what the most advanced robots, people like, robots like Bina 48, those are the most advanced robots, where they are doing their best to embed consciousness. That's a very specific thing that they're trying to do, right? We'll see.
So I want to challenge you a little bit here at this point with this idea of anthropomorphization, which I think was really well explored in the book or the story, Super Toys Last All Summer Long, which was then turned into the movie AI, the Steven Spielberg, Stanley Kubrick movie, back in the year 2000, 2001, whenever that movie came out, like 20 years ago now. Again, I don't like to use the word concern in this place, because I think that if we walk towards this technology with fear and trepidation, then we make mistakes just as many as we would make if we walk towards it with just like, hey, everything's going to be great, isn't this going to be awesome? So I think we have to be measured and intelligent and intentional. That's the word. In our approach to this. So I want to be intentional in my questions here, because I want to be very careful in what I'm saying, but I also want to find out something here. So we have no problem giving our cats personalities, or our pets, right? We have an entire industry. I tell my kids this all the time when we go to the pet store. America is the greatest country on the planet. This is how you know. We have an entire store devoted to people's pets. Like, just stores, just amazing, right? And yes, I know all my listeners in Australia and in Western Europe, you're going to tell me there's pet stores there too. Yes, great, thank you. I appreciate that. But there's places in the world where there are no pet stores. Like, that's not a thing, right? Because a pet is just something that runs around and whatever. And I'm not saying that people don't anthropomorphize their pets in those other places. They do, but we've built it up into an industry, right? Which is weirdly capitalistic of us. Okay, with all that being said, does my cat have a personality? Maybe, maybe not. Like, we're not really like clear on even that, right? But we layer on these things, and then we seek to have them reflected back to us. And that's the core idea here. So we layer on these things, or we'll do this with inanimate objects. For instance, people's cell phones. People are already doing this. They're layering on personality to their cell phones that is reflective of them. And it's an object, just like anything else. And again, this idea was explored in AI, right? Because there's this whole scene in the movie, and there's this sequence in the book, where there are basically androids that have been thrown away, have been tossed out, right? And they're basically garbage. And, when you see it in the movie, it tugs on your heartstrings, because you're like, oh, that's inhumane. But nobody cries over a garbage dump full of cell phones. So where are we going with that? And is that a challenge to human consciousness? Is that idea, because I've seen the DARPA robots, right, from Boston Dynamics. And, none of those DARPA robots are warm and cuddly. They don't look like dogs. They look like they're going to and if anybody wants to go and YouTube this, you can go YouTube this. You can go YouTube DARPA robots from Boston Dynamics. You look at them and I think immediately of Terminator. I'll just be honest. I think immediately of Terminator, and I'm like, great, that's fabulous.
Well, this is where I mean, now you're kind of what you're touching into is kind of it does begin to dip its toe into the transhuman movement. Books,
a little
books
bit, but it also hinges on that human consciousness piece.
Well,
right?
Because you're going between personality and intelligence.
Okay.
Personality and intelligence, which have crossovers in their constructs,
mm-hmm.
which have different elements and purposes to them.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing, a recent book that is really, I think, quite wonderful about this is Clara and the Sun by Shiguro, which is a brilliant book. But it's, when we're beginning to talk about even sentient beings, mm-hmm. right? So when things like now the new research on octopi, mm-hmm. which they know are highly intelligent, mm-hmm. highly more intelligent than a young child. The research that's done on pigs, that they know pigs are more intelligent. It's like when they're beginning to measure intelligence. Mm-hmm. And then when you go into personality, it's different, right? Mm-hmm. And then there are different schools of thought on that. So again, I could talk about these things, each one of these things individually,
right,
forever.
Right.
I think in the meantime, what I'm really forcing myself to focus on these days is this idea of especially for leadership, right? Mm-hmm. As the AI is developing, right? How are we? I'm a co-chair of a committee at IEEE right now on an education committee, expanding AI ethics education.
Yep.
And this gets into, the philosophers you're talking about. St. Augustine is a perfect example, right? Of people who wrote about, Toni Morrison's work on what is moral, what is not moral. These are the kinds of works. Philosophers, we need philosophers in AI, mm-hmm. right? We need philosophy in AI. We need psychology in AI. Mm-hmm. We need humanities. The humanities in AI. So that this idea, and for me, that's what the Human Arts Lab is. That's my thing. So that is what HAL is, right? Is this idea of leaders and teams and organizations coming in to have an interactive experience where they can begin to see how social, emotional, and creative intelligences mm-hmm. will help them as we move, because I call it, when you were talking before about this idea of, I loved that you were talking about not going into it afraid.
Right.
This idea of, can we partner? How do we partner with they're autonomous intelligences that we're creating.
Right.
Right. And some of them are a little bit of a runaway train. So that's one of the reasons we really need the AI ethics, right?
Right.
Like, did I really think about that? No, hey, Mom, I really wanted to build this thing. What just happened? It just went through the wall. It's like, so, but we're not thinking about it in advance, which is why eventually we're starting in the IEEE project. We're starting with engineers and business leaders and developers and those stakeholders, but eventually getting to K through 12.
Yeah.
Because we really need, if kids are building Lego, if I'm building a Lego building, why can't I think about whether or not, who would be living in there and what would it be like if that person living in there? Those are the things we can build in to how we educate. The subject of the fact that we don't have enough critical thinking in education is, that's another one we could probably, I know we could talk about forever, but right.
That's one of the reasons I started this podcast.
There we go. I know. And so it's one of the reasons I listen to this podcast. So it's, these are things that I think are really important that it's the questions. What questions are we asking of ourselves? What questions are our leaders asking? So our leaders, rather than our leaders having the answers, what questions are our leaders asking? To me, that's gold, right? It's actually the golden standard. I'm an educational psychologist. It's the gold standard in pedagogy.
Right.
Like, what are the questions, right? How good are your open-ended questions? How good is your open-ended inquiry? And so, to me, that's really, I think that's needs to be at the forefront. I think it's an older model, and I understand the model. I do. It's not a criticism; it's a critique more of leaders having to have the answers. And sometimes you do. In a crisis, it's like, I want to go to the person, I want to go to the woman or the man who says, I know what to do. We're going to do this right now. And they might be right or wrong, but at least they've made a choice. And they may have done a very well informed choice, right? Made a well informed choice. The thing is, now, as we face this really, wide open frontier. I love Captain Kirk.
Yeah.
Who asks the whole team all the time, what do you think? What should we do? What should we do? This is a new land.
Yep.
And that, to me, that is actually Heifetz from Harvard. Heifetz is who created the framework for adaptive leadership. That's the model. Am I asking, right? Because I still have to be, there still are leaders, not necessarily one. There still are leaders, but how am I really utilizing the intelligences, the multiple intelligences that we have? So to me, this is also part of why I believe, they call it the Great Resignation. I refer to it more as a great reshuffling. I think it's a really great opportunity.
So a couple of things there that you mentioned that I want to piggyback off of for just a moment. So I love Kirk. Kirk was a man of action. He was, and it's interesting how Roddenberry, and I can't watch any of the new Star Treks. I'm just going to be honest on the podcast here. I just can't, because they're reflective of our time. And our time is not a time of definite optimism. Our time is a time of definite pessimism. We know the future was coming, but we know it's also going to be, we know, I put no in air quotes, we know it's going to be horrible. And that's just a function of where we are at now. Whereas Kirk and Roddenberry's conception of Kirk, Gunsmoke in Space, was a conception of post World War II optimism, right? That an entire generation had. I'm actually one of the training modules that we do in our training company is really focused on this idea of managing the multi-generational workforce. And it's really interesting to talk about how the 3 to 4 generations that are currently in the workplace, conceptually based on culture and technology and shared collective history in a generational time frame, perceive leadership differently. That's a gigantic concept that most leaders, most managers and supervisors in organizations are not ever faced with. They're just sort of told, here's your bundle of people, good luck. And people are containers, talking about consciousness and personality and intelligence, layering all three of those together. People are bundles of intelligence and consciousness and personality. And we didn't talk about emotions. I'm an emotional intelligence guy too, and emotions. And then unexamined philosophy, unexamined culture, unexamined, and it just just layers and layers and layers, right? And the leadership challenge is taking all these people, and I'm a Picard guy, which again is a reflection of the 1990s, taking all these people and collaboratively, in every single episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, he's sitting around a table trying to collaboratively come up with an answer to a question. But at the end of the day, he makes the decision. Now, my mom, just to use this as an example, my mom's very much an old school, original Star Trek. She's an OG original Star Trek person. And I'm a Star Trek Next Generation person. Like, I could watch that one, but I'm like, this is reflective of this. But Next Generation is absolutely reflective of that collaborative 1990s, we can solve all problems, a little bit more definite optimism, but not as much as the original series. And then, of course, you get into things like Deep Space Nine, and the whole thing goes off the rails. But but my point is, that idea of collaboration is exactly what you're talking about with adaptive leadership. And popular culture feeds us that. popular culture also feeds us these ideas around, or these philosophies, right? And I opened with talking about dystopian philosophies, right? It feeds us these dystopian philosophies. And so I'm going to ask a jog question here to the side on philosophy, and then I'm going to kind of bring it back. Why is it when we talk about this idea of intelligence inside of a machine, or consciousness, let's use that term, inside of a machine, why do we trend in our thinking culturally and philosophically, at least in the West, and I don't know about other countries, maybe in other countries it trends differently, but in the West, in America specifically, why do we trend towards that sort of Blade Runner, it's all going to be terrible kind of mentality? I'm always curious about that, because it seems to have held, gosh, ever since we dropped the nuclear weapons in World War II.
Well, I think there are a number of reasons that I would posit.
Sure.
Right? Because, right.
Yeah. We're having a philosophical, critical thinking conversation.
Right.
Here, sure.
But there are a number of things that come to mind for me. One, the first thing that comes to mind to me is collectivism versus individualism.
Okay.
Right. So we're immediately thinking of the control and autonomy and agency of an individual.
Right.
Right. And how much power one individual has over others. Right. Mm-hmm. The other thing, right. Another thing that comes into, because, you're talking about, there are a number of things that you also mentioned that I love, right. Social identity.
Yeah.
And then you're talking about cultural identity, which have crossovers, but are not the same, right? There's all kinds of work. There's Deborah Plummer's work and Zaretta Hammond's work on this idea of all of those things that come into play. But there's also a Western, which actually is kind of a handmate, mm-hmm. is the idea of power. Right. Yes. So there's autonomy, there's power, and who has power, and that one person has power. So it's not collective. Mm-hmm. Right. I wrote a paper that I presented at the Man in Cybergenetics conference for IEEE 2020, which was on collective intelligence. This idea, if we are going to create machines, or we are creating these systems of impact, mm-hmm. can we use transdisciplinary groups for collective intelligence? And that is really it's not, I mean, I'm certainly not original in the conversation, but it is a conversation that needs to be had, and that is more difficult, you're right, in a Western context, where we have an Elon Musk, or we have an individual mm-hmm. who has more power to create another individual, right? It's like, it's the God thing, right? I just created something in my own image.
Right. Well, and you know what? And okay. Well, and looking at, and this is why on this podcast we read the root books, because right. I'm right. sorry, you can't talk about artificial intelligence. I'm going to do it right. in a Western context anyway, without going back to Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was out formed, void, and darkness was. But you can't. You got to go back.
The thing is, right. The thing is that these are the conversations. These conversations actually are happening, which is an interesting thing with AI developer. That like people like Kurzweil. There's not a lot of others, but there are people like Kurzweil who because that's their whole raison d'être. But
right.
But this is again why, to me, as well as the philosophy, right, and going into Joseph Campbell and is how are we, this business of leadership that we're still how is it we're still having an argument about soft skills? How are we even calling that anymore? I did a TED talk about this. My TED talk is about this. It's about the idea that it's like, if soft skills, they're nice, but not necessary. And right, that's the way it's viewed in business. And if it was in business, if soft skills, if social, emotional, and creative intelligences actually were implemented, the education, the skills were taught in school, if it was done in business, it would be in schools tomorrow. But because it doesn't, because it's not valued in business, there's, this is where I really believe there is a connection between this old model of business is not, I love that you've brought in emotions, but business does not have emotions. It's one of the brilliant things about Otto Scharmer and the U-Lab is Scharmer is, one of the lead thinkers at MIT, this idea that head, heart, hand, create all of these things are essential.
Right.
For the leadership of the future, because if we are to partner with machines, what is where are our differences? And can we celebrate our differences and elevate our differences so that we can actually make this a beautiful and productive thing? I said, I'm a determined optimist.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's good because I there are people who already know me who are going to listen to this and they're going to laugh when I minimize this, but it's true. I tend to be a little bit more pessimistic in my viewpoint, a little bit mostly about human nature. But again, it's going off of looking at the same things in the course of the last 5,000 years and drawing different conclusions, right? And I think you need both sides. And this is why I get frustrated with most of this sort of dystopian stuff. And I've stopped looking at a whole lot of it over the course of the last 10, 15 years. Because A, it's a reflection of whatever the current time is. Okay. Particularly in popular culture. But also B, it's just telling one side of the story. Right. And so, everything's not 100% right in the world. You have to have a balanced perspective and a balanced approach to things like this, particularly if you're going to act without fear, right? You said something which I think is very interesting, which touches into our next question about the Human Arts Lab. Again, HAL, which I love. I'm not going to let you do that, Dave. I love that. But speaking of dystopian, well, okay, so I'm also a huge, giant film person, as you can see from the poster behind me. And of course, if you're listening to this on the audio, you can't see it, but go watch it on the YouTube. You'll see the video, the poster behind me from Megamind. You'll love it. But I'm a huge movie person, right? And I follow directors and writers. I've kind of I noodled that deep down into it, and cinematographers and all of that, because it's an offshoot of the humanities. And I came out of the arts. I came out of the fine arts space. So I took fine arts and philosophy and all that kind of stuff. And then I bring that with our leadership consultancy and our publishing company over to business. And so you said a couple of things there that I want to piggyback off of. And the first thing that you said was, if the quote unquote soft skills, and I hate that term too, or dislike strongly, if those necessary skills were brought over, you're right, they would be more considered, right? And I think that the reason that they haven't been, and I've really done a lot of research and thought into this, is it really goes back to Henry Ford. It really goes back to the industrialization of human labor. And this idea that Marisa or Jesan or our listeners or our viewers, or people that people that I know, that their entire value, and the Matrix did a really good job of sort of bringing this around to the idea of a battery, can be whittled down to its smallest possible part and then scaled up, which is a fine idea if you want to increase material abundance for everyone. It works. We know it works. We have 120 years of evidence that works. Fundamentally, though, we are at the end of material abundance, and now we need different things. And by the way, it doesn't mean that we're at the end of having every single abundance problem solved. It means, or having it solved for everybody collectively, as you were saying, because there's still individuals inside of the collective who just don't have the same level of material abundance as everybody else. You mentioned Elon Musk. I don't have the money that Elon Musk has, and Elon Musk hasn't had the money that I've had probably since he was 25. God bless him, okay? But when you're at the end of material abundance, then you run into all other kinds of spiritual problems. And so I'm going to drop this on you a little bit. what are the spiritual considerations? And I don't mean religious. I mean, what are the spiritual implications of thinking machines, or at least machines that do their best impression of thinking? What are the spiritual implications there? Because I can easily see, well, I mean, I'm a follower of Christianity. You're a follower of whatever you follow. Everybody has belief that goes way deeper than emotion and intelligence and all the kinds of things that we've just mentioned, even deeper than philosophy. Faith, right? What does it mean to have faith? A machine that thinks that has my face challenges that, right?
Repeat that question, because
Sure.
the rest of it I totally got.
Yeah.
I was just confused about the last part of
Yes.
the question.
A machine that thinks, that looks, appears human to me, whether it's individual or collective, challenges me, right? So have you invited, I'll frame it even more simply, IEEE, have you invited the theologians in? Because the theologians have something to say about all of this.
Yes, actually, there's a very interesting. There's a lot. What I love that you brought it up. There's a spectacular writer named Melanie Goodchild. She's a Native North American, who does work at MIT, in fact, and she talks about indigenous wisdom.
Okay.
And how indigenous wisdom can be thought of if we're beginning to consider consciousness, if we're having conversations about consciousness, that there are going to be conversations about spirituality, right?
Right.
Is there an entity? Is there a spiritual entity here? And we see this, we've seen this in any of the science fiction. Does that entity have a spirit? And, and do I have an answer to that? No, I have my own feelings about the differences and the applications. I think that I think I always want to redirect it is those are the kinds of things that may trigger us or touch us in a profound way that hopefully lead us back and leaders back to saying, is this moral? Is what I do, right? Because when we're talking about spirit, and I'm not a religious person. I'm a spiritual person, but I am absolutely not a religious person.
Sure. Okay.
The thing is, it is my spirit that comes back and says, morally, I believe that my spirit is about that my morals and my spirit have a relationship.
Okay. Yeah.
And that it is my moral to ask, is this right? Do I believe this to be morally right? And this is where we need everyone. That's why the paper I wrote was on transdisciplinary, because transdisciplinary is different than just interdisciplinary. We're not talking about many different engineers, or we're talking about people across disciplines, across ways of thinking, ways of knowing, right? So ways of knowing are different than sometimes what is considered traditional expertise,
right?
But which is why we want to bring in these wisdoms that are around us. And it's challenging. I mean, all of this is wildly challenging, because what we're really beginning to do by asking these questions is beginning to break down some of these paradigms and some of these fortresses that have said, as you were talking about moving into the Industrial Revolution and industrializing humans.
Right. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
The machination of human beings is that if we step away from that, now we have to begin to think of all of the other things that are connected. And to me, that's the work I really love. So I love to say, okay, if this is morally wrong, then what's the effect of all of my business, not just the autonomous intelligence that I'm using.
Right.
What is right? So that then we get into a discussion on sustainability or triple bottom line or B Corps or right. Okay. So that when I'm beginning to talk, to me, those things are integral?
Mm-hmm.
And those are hard questions. You know, I mean, BlackRock, right? BlackRock says, 2019, every company should be a triple, should be B Corp and be triple bottom line. And everybody says they are, or they say they're doing it. But in fact, have they really delved into understanding what that means? And there's such fear because if I say I'm giving up profit above everything, profit before people, if I give that up, where's my lifeboat? And when we want to, right, and what we want, really believing, it's a belief. I love that you brought in spirituality, because it's a belief to say, if this business really dedicates itself to solving problems for people and the planet, that can be making clothes. Mm-hmm. That's how we will make our profit. Is our profit coming from a place of service?
Well, the other dynamic is, and I read that pronouncement from BlackRock and all of that, and I'm going to be generous. I kind of rolled my eyes because it is fine to put out a pronouncement. I'm going to paraphrase from Andrew Jackson here. BlackRock put out a pronouncement. Now let's see them back it up. Because the reality of the tension, which again is something I think that leaders have to pay attention to. You mentioned, the fear. The reality of the tension is that may work for Walmart, but the bodega down the street where the guy's or the woman is just looking to feed their family by making sandwiches and is barely making a 1% profit a year and is most of the time underwater and is struggling to do right by their minimum number of employees, they're not thinking about triple bottom line in the planet. Like they're not. That's not a concern for them. The concern for them is, how do I stay open paying $9,000 a month in rent in New York City?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I don't think those are mutually exclusive.
I think there's a tension there, and I think that leaders have to resolve that tension.
Yeah, and I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I don't care. The size of the business is really not so important. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. And honestly, the BlackRock, I know I made a joke about it, but I have to say I applaud it. It's, listen, at least they said it out loud.
They said it out loud. Right, they said it out loud.
Right?
That's true.
And
yes.
So I will say, okay, even if it's not being realized fully, that being put into the zeitgeist, to me, is really valuable.
Well, and it does get back to this tension between the individual and the collective, which, again, is something that, while philosophers have, and theologians and others have explored that, and by the way, in a Western context, I want to revisit this for just a second. In a Western context, we have struggled to get to the individual over the collective over the course of 2,000 years, and that's a lot of, well, I'm going to paraphrase from Nietzsche here. There's a lot of blood on all of our collective hands, if we want to make a collective, to get to that idea that the individual person has autonomy against the state. This is what Alexander Solzhenitsyn was arguing about in the Gulag Archipelago, right? Or what Milan Kundera talks about in The Unbearable Lightness of Being, in a very oblique kind of way, but he gets there, right? Or even Fyodor Dostoevsky in The Brothers Karamazov or Crime and Punishment. This dynamic of the individual versus the collective, and what can the collective tell you to do versus how do you stand, by yourself or individually. Now, when we break this down to business, it's what can the collective big business entities tell you to do versus the tension of what does that sole proprietor do, or what does that person with a small team do.
I also think, to me, the interesting examination and challenge is making the individual and the collective not mutually exclusive. So bringing in utilizing the potential of the individual within the collective, right?
Ah, okay.
Right. So, I mean, that was another one of the talks I just recently did, Stardust and the uniqueness of human potential. We literally are made of stars, and we're made of unique particles of stars. No one is like any one of us.
Right.
And yet we can work collectively. And how do we do that in business? It's a challenge. But people like, to me, I look to people like Paul Pullman from Unilever, right? Who, not perfect, but they pushed the bar, right? And so we see it, and yes, that's a huge business, but it's a huge business made up of many tiny businesses.
Right. Yeah. They have a long. Yeah.
Right. And so to me, I think the promise of that exists. There's a lot. I love that you brought in faith, because it brings in a lot of leaps of faith.
It does. Well, and you have to faith and trust, trust in the goodwill of others. One of the things that counterbalances my more pessimistic tendencies is that I was a mediator for many years. And I did see people, maybe not necessarily transform all the way down to their core, although I do know people who are in that space of transformative mediation, where they'll work with clients for years to get them to actually shift, maybe away from the individual towards the collective, or in some cases, maybe away from the collective back towards the individual, try to find that balance, right? So I've worked with people who are in that space. I'm not wired to be in that space so much. I'm too pugilistic, and I'm too I'm self-aware about who I am as a leader. I'm too pugilistic, and I have my own tensions that I got to deal with. But I've seen people do that work, and so I know it works, right? And I've seen people change, even if it's just a microscopic move to the left or to the right. And we do this podcast, we do trainings, I write books to get people to, we even work with kids, to work to move people just slightly to the left, just 2 inches to the left. Because if you move 2 inches to the left or 2 inches to the right, you can shift almost everything. Give me a big enough lever, I can move the world, right? And so for our perspective, for our consultancy, for our publishing company, the technology is the lever, it's not the shift. And that's kind of how I tend to view, or maybe tend to believe, that's maybe where we need to go with things like autonomous intelligences, or things like intelligent machines, right?
Well, the thing is, but they are embedded in almost every single aspect of our operations of life, right? So it's not even just at business, in our lives. So how are we thinking about how we use them? And I just think that, the more educated we become about asking questions, right? The more we can advocate, we can have more of our own agency. We can begin to make meaningful change if we really want it to happen. So it's a process. They're all processes. But I also I look to leaders to do this, to be models.
Right.
I say, will you be, what kind of model do you want to be? What legacy? What's the impact you want to have? And I'm not talking about the impact. There's a fantastic book by Roman Zarnarek called The Good Ancestor.
Okay.
Which is, about this idea of what legacy will we leave? What, how do I want to, if you were talking about souls or spirits, what spirit do I want to, what do I want to be following me, or be left of me? And so I think these are really important. And there's a lot of people who are like, oh, that's just too big for leadership. But I think that's what leadership is.
No, I think that's at the core probably of leadership. Not core probably. It is at the core of leadership. And I think that, again, when you get to a point where you only need to do a few clicks here or there to create a product or service that people want, and then you can get enough material abundance to feed your family, which is your first responsibility, feed your employees, which is your second responsibility, and then impact the community, because these things scale up, right? If you're not feeding your family, you're not feeding yourself, how can you feed somebody else? You can't feed from an empty plate. This is the the idea of going down and, the plane goes down, you got to put the mask on yourself first before you can save anybody else, right? Okay. So, when we've gotten to the point where we can build, and we have people building businesses based on 1-click, 2-click. I'll just use something very, very baseline here. 2-click drop shipping. We have people who are making 6 figures a year doing 2-click drop shipping. Now I have children and I've got a house and I've got all these other kinds of things. I can tell you 6 figures a year that's like baseline these days, particularly with inflation and other things going on, right? Okay. But like you hit your baseline. Now what else can you do? And so now it becomes the challenge to think about those other things versus maybe exclusively focusing on profit, or exclusively focus on profit motive. I think where people get caught up is when you mentioned Elon Musk, just to go back to him for just a minute, or Jeff Bezos. When people say they are saving the planet, but then their actions don't back that up, and that gets into the role modeling piece, right? Or they say they're building things for the collective benefit of humanity, but then their actions that we then see later on don't match up for that. And that mismatch between what they say and what we see is what drives the average follower who doesn't have access to thinking about any of this stuff, who's just living their lives, drives them nuts.
Yeah. Well, that's the right. It goes beyond cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
To psychological emotional dissonance. It's like one of these things
it almost wanders into gaslighting at a certain point.
Right. Well, because it's one of these things is not like the other, and I thought it was, and there is something that is off, and I'm not sure where the bridge is.
Correct.
And so I just think that leadership is about the willingness to be a model, the willingness to demonstrate, right? That's I think that I know that as a parent, that's true for me as a parent. Yeah. I owned a business many years ago. Mm-hmm. I knew what it was like as a business. Mm-hmm. That this is, are you willing to be that model? And if you are, what are you willing to do to make that true?
Yeah.
And I view it much less as a challenge to leaders as an invitation. How can I invite you, right? How can I invite you in to take, because I think there's so much fear.
Oh, yeah.
I think there's just so much fear. There's fear of, I don't know what to do. I don't know enough about ethics. I don't know enough about questions. I don't know enough about the technology. So I'm going to have somebody else do it because I'm just too afraid.
Yeah.
And it's like, and I can't admit to anyone I'm afraid. There's so many of these things that come into play. And again, I think, I hate to sound like a broken record with it. I feel like it comes back to what are the human skills, the compassion, empathy, self-compassion, right? That we can cultivate in ourselves so that we can meet, because each one of these challenges is going to be a little bit different, right?
Well, the writer and marketer Seth Godin wrote many years ago, watching the beginnings of algorithmic data mining happening in marketing 20 years ago. He said, there will come a time, and I'm paraphrasing and maybe putting words in his mouth here, but the idea is solid here. And if Seth is listening, he'd be like, yeah, that idea is solid. The thing that human beings have to do at the end of all of this, he said that the thing is we will algorithm away all of the stuff that human beings could do but didn't need to. That was just distractions. We'll take all of that away. And what will be left are the things that only human beings can't do, that cannot be algorithmed away. Mm-hmm. And I interpreted that when I first read that as, oh, he's talking about emotional intelligence. He's talking about all of the intelligences that, and you mentioned them, empathy, compassion, caring, trust building, the relational aspects of life that, again, we don't think about, that we have struggled to find a profit motive for, which is why nonprofits, where people care, don't make any money, because we can't click those two things together in our heads. Or I shouldn't say don't make any money, struggle to make their money, right? Very often, because people don't click those two things together. They don't go, oh, that woman's giving a hug to her kid in the grocery store rather than smacking him on the butt after he screwed around and melted down. That's interesting, but I got to go live my day, right? We don't connect that to an actual economic outcome, 5 years from now or 10 years from now when that kid isn't in jail and is instead at Harvard. We don't connect those because it's too long a timeline, and it's too finite, and it's too much like gossamer. I want to use that term. It's too much like emotional mental gossamer. Plus, it's a moment in my day, and I got to go pick up the meat so I can go home to my family where I got to deal with my kid.
Right there, but there and not but and there are some really amazing people out there putting. I mean, Kate Rayworth and Donut Economics are the caring economy. Rihanna Eisler, right? When we're talking about the caring economy, where there are actually models for it.
Right.
And there are working models for it. And so this is where, the whole regenerative movement. I mean, I've got a whole list of books that I'm
send
dying
us a list
to
of the books. We will put
send, right, because
we'll put it on.
I have mine, like John Elkington, Green Swans, right? Margaret Heffernan, Race After Technology, Ruha Benjamin. She's amazing, right? So there are people. Or actually, Paul Pullman has a new book out, Net Positive: How Courageous Companies Thrive by Giving More Than They Take.
Interesting. We will have a list. By the way, we'll have links to all of that.
Yeah, so I love, right, that to me, that's the stuff that really excites me.
Yeah.
Because they are leaders who are doing what we're talking about, right? They're those leaders who say, we can do this.
Right.
And we're going to figure out ways to, I think, again, invite us in, right?
So I think a lot of this stuff happens from the top down. It starts at very high levels, and then it filters down to what I call the street level, which is typically where I train at. I train at the street level, and there's people who are training who are developing folks who are at the Costco's and Walmarts and BlackRocks of the world. And those people are doing great work. But I decided a long time ago I don't want to do that work there, because what's more impactful for me and where I see the more immediate impact is in my community, working with the local nonprofit to help the executive director be a better leader. Because those people who are on his team, those 15 people there, as I've been saying recently, they don't care about the president of the United States. 60% of them don't vote anyway. And 99% of them their lives aren't run by politics. They don't even know who the mayor of their town is. Right. They know what culture is, but only culture that they like. They really care about how that executive director at that nonprofit treats them. That's their number one example of leadership. And when that executive director is confronted by something like COVID, or confronted by something like a new behavioral-based technology where he can make ads better, he's got or she has a real challenge there. She has a real challenge there for her 15 people. Because if she doesn't make the right decision there, it won't be an immediate domino, but it will be a domino that falls. And that dichotomy, I use Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, but that dichotomy between how that executive director lives their lives and what they are seen as in the public sphere in their community really does matter. And by the way, most small business owners know this. They know this. This is why we work with small and medium-sized business owners, because they know this, and they struggle mightily internally with how to balance those two things together. Because the penalty for that is so much more immediate, because the scale is so much lower. When we think about that dynamic of scale, one of the things that we've been exploring on this podcast, and then I'm going to ask you about the the challenges to developing ethical standards. We've kind of talked a little bit about that, but some of the challenges to developing these ethical standards when you're working with engineers, because I want to get into that a little bit before we go. But when you talk about scale, right? One of the things we've been exploring on this podcast is the how do I want to frame this? It's it's the victory of Nietzschean nihilism. Like, Nietzschean nihilism has won the day. Now at the top, it might be shifting around and changing. We might be moving away from that, but because ideas scale from the bottom to the top, or from the top to the bottom, at the bottom, Nietzschean nihilism runs the day. People may talk in optimistic terms, but they behave like they're nihilists. And they may sometimes make nihilistic decisions without ever knowing what that term means. They don't know Nietzsche. They don't know any of it. And this is something that's been bugging me for quite some time. And so I want to ask you, okay, how do we close that loop? How do we defeat that nihilism? And again, I don't think Nietzsche was triumphant in his statement about God being dead. I think he was very concerned about this. He was very concerned about, where does human value come from? How do you create value out of your own self? And now we're on the cusp of creating something that will look like us, either collectively or individually, but it doesn't matter in that case. We're on the cusp of that, and now we also still have this tussle at the bottom of the pile with, how do we create meaning? Leaders are going to have to navigate that tension, and that's going to be really hard. But leaders first have to identify what that is and the language for that, and then be able to explain it to their followers. How can understanding the ethical issues around AI help us navigate through nihilism so that we don't get caught by it?
Well, I think that once we begin to ask ethical questions of ourselves, and we begin to explain why we're doing what we're doing, right? Well, once a leader, even though it's not a popular decision, that's one of the things in adaptive leadership. Sometimes it has to be, it's an unpopular decision. Yeah. And I'm making this unpopular decision, but these are the reasons why I'm making that decision. And being really, real transparency and real ownership of these are the considerations that I have, these are the reasons that I have, these are the risks that I'm taking, right? And that these are the risks that are involved for all of us. You know, I mean, one of my favorite business leaders in that was Don Katz when he started Audible. I know Don. Don's an old friend. When Don started Audible, you know, they were taking huge risks. The people working with him all were taking huge risks, and he just kept saying, "Well, these are the decisions that we're making right now because this is the right thing to do." And so I think that's, to me, I know it sounds oversimplified, but I think that's the direction that, to me, those are even ethical. It's an ethical way of thinking about, why am I doing what I'm doing? Do I have reasons for what am I doing? Is there good at the heart of what I'm doing? Yeah. Right. And I think that's really the focus to take and the way to go.
Well, thank you, Marisa, for your time today. We talked a lot about a lot of things. I would have loved to have talked longer, but I know you've given us your time, and I want to thank you for that. I want to thank you for coming on the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. I want to thank you for answering my probing and sometimes rambling questions about artificial intelligence. I don't know that we got directly into the AI thing, but I think we covered the beginnings of the territory around it, which will give our listeners a lot of different pinprick pathways into looking at your work with the Human Arts Lab, looking at your work with IEEE, and of course, looking at your work with Open Channel Culture. Is there anything you'd like to promote today on the podcast? Anything you'd like to tell people to go to? Your list of books we will put in our show notes.
Well, I'm thrilled. Jesan, I love talking to you because it's, you know, this is where I was talking about being a polymath earlier, right? Like that, it's like one from one to another. It's very exciting, very exciting. And your knowledge of literature and your knowledge of great thinkers is really spectacular. So I will share those. I would love people to just visit my website, openchannelculture.com. It'll be on the website at openchannelculture.com. There are many resources. It's under construction right now, but most of the resources are there. My talks are all there, and the papers that I've written from IEEE are all there. That work is all there, and I think more than anything, I'm thrilled that there are these conversations happening. I'm thrilled that you're working with companies to ask these kinds of questions of themselves. And I think there need to be more of us. I think that there just need to be more people creating these environments and these opportunities for leaders, whether it's companies, whether it's organizations, what community groups, beginning to ask these questions. That's the beginning. And then sharing our education as much as possible so that education doesn't become exclusionary.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, we will have links to Open Channel Culture. We'll have links to Human Arts Lab. We'll have links to Marisa's TED Talks and the book list that she's got. We'll probably stick that on the website as an addition in the show notes. She mentioned several books that I think are worthwhile to pick up that intersect with some of the readings that we do here on Leadership Lessons from the Great Books. Once again, thank you, Marisa. I'm gonna let you head out here, and you have a great day.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
And there goes Marisa of Open Channel Culture. So great conversation. We didn't exactly hit every single thing that I wanted to talk about with Marisa here on Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, but we did hit many of the important points. And I believe fundamentally that the biggest point that we hit was this one. Human beings need to get better at doing the things that human beings do better. Better at caring, better at being compassionate, better at being open, better at engaging with empathy with others. Is there a profit motive in empathy? Is there a profit motive to compassion? Is there a profit motive to caring? Yes, there is. And I want to frame it in terms not of a profit motive, but in terms of a long game, a short game, and a midterm game. Long games are games you play for your entire lifetime. They are games in your business. They're games in your family life. They are games in your culture, of your team, or of your organization. These are games. These are interactions, we want to frame it that way, that have long-term benefit that reverberate down through time. Midterm games are games that only reverberate for months or maybe years, where the outcomes are limited, the boundaries are narrow, and the goals are well defined. Short-term games are, well, they're like eating a piece of candy, or they're like eating a donut. They give you a high for a moment, but then you crash. And your team crashes, you crash as a leader, your organization sometimes crashes. And the problem with the short-term games is you have to keep chasing the high. And of course, the high that you got previously isn't enough, and so you have to keep chasing more and more and more. We have built over the last 120 years, and predominantly over the last 100 years of the Industrial Revolution, we've built an entire culture on short-term games, not midterm games, and very few long-term games. What's going to happen with artificial intelligence, with algorithms, with data, with Bitcoin, and with blockchain, with NFTs, even with the meta universe and being able to trade virtually or being able to augment reality? What's going to happen is all of those short-term games are going to be algorithmed away, artificially intelligenced away, or metaversed away. They'll still happen. Those highs will still be chased, but the abundant outcomes from them will be more and more and more. And of course, the high you will have to chase will get further and further away. But don't worry, we can always just switch some things around in the programming and the high will keep on getting chased. So, If the machines are going to do the thing that you used to do as a leader in chasing the short game, then the only thing that's left to you is to chase the midterm, or in some cases, even as the midterm game gets algorithmed away, the long-term game, which is where leaders need to figure out what that game is. The game of compassion, the game of empathy, the game of caring, the game of emotional intelligence, the game of collaboration, the game of genuine decision-making. It means that leaders have to slow down. They have to pay attention to how they are role modeling the long game, and they have to do so without fear of losing the short game or trepidation. COVID-19 and the COVID-19 pandemic or crisis has really revealed how little experience leaders have in playing a long game. All the way down, remember I talked about scale on the podcast, all the way down from the Walmarts to the bodega, and all the way back up from the sole proprietor to the head of BlackRock. If you would like to stay on the path, if you would like to figure out how you can win more midterm and long games, and how you can begin to ignore or maybe just processize the short games, I would encourage you to reach out to us here at HSCT Publishing, where our tools, our webinars, our trainings, our books, even this podcast and our events can help you become a better leader, a better role model in the long game, help you make more ethical decisions with more ethical considerations that will allow you to win the games that will make your team better, your organization better, and fundamentally your community better long after you are gone. Check us out, www.hsctpublishing.com. Also, go ahead and check us out on our Leadership Toolbox website, leadershiptoolbox.us. Please check us out on the Leading Keys platform, which is our asynchronous modules of leadership content for small and medium-sized businesses, subscription-based, of course, at leadingkeys.com. Listen to this podcast, Leadership Lessons from the Great Books, and subscribe. Give us a 4-star rating wherever you happen to listen to us on Apple, Google. Spotify has just begun doing ratings, so we would love to be rated in Spotify. And, of course, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Pandora. If you just want to read a book, we also recommend that. I write books, and we publish books, and I read books, as you know. And so we've got our 3rd book coming out, 12 Lessons for Leaders, a foundation for intentional leadership. Check it out at leadershiptoolbox.us/book and join our pre-order list today. Actually, I'm sorry, that's not 12 lessons for leaders. It's 12 rules for leaders. Check that out on our website there and join our pre-order list if you would like to figure out what the 12 rules are for leaders. By the way, one of those rules does focus around the leveraging of emotional intelligence for success. Finally, we've got another podcast. Actually, we've got a couple of other podcasts, but our big one is called the My Boss Doesn't Care podcast. 100 episodes featuring fleshing out and talking about the essays and ideas that are in my 2nd book, My Boss Doesn't Care, which you can get on Amazon or you can get as an audiobook on Audible. All right. Once again, thank you to Marisa Zalaback. Go and check her out, openchannelculture.com, and go check out what she's doing with the Human Arts Lab and Google her. We will have lists of her books and her resources on all of our websites and, of course, in our show notes below this podcast episode. All right. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of your leadership day. I'm out.